All of you, our Athenaeum members, our New York Society and New Haven Young Man's Club members, and people from other libraries, and folks who just heard about us and wanted to attend this program. We are so delighted that you are with us at the Athenaeum of Philadelphia's Fall 2020 Virtual Speaker Series. On this rainy night, as Tess said earlier, it is so nice, even though we're missing being in this beautiful space of the Athenaeum, not to have to leave your home and brave the puddles. So thank you. I just saw a note from Tess. I'm Beth Hessel, the Executive Director of the Athenaeum of Philadelphia. On the screen, you also see our wonderful Tess Galen, who is our events coordinator, who made sure you all got signed up and got this link. And we're so grateful for all that she does. And our distinguished guest, Dr. Leo Damrosch, who I will give you a better introduction in just a moment. As you may know, especially if you're a member of another one of our historic independent libraries, the Athenaeum is one of those libraries that has a long and distinguished history of scholarly inquiry, lively conversations, and a strong community for lifelong learners, just as you will find in that club of several hundred years ago. If you're not yet a member, but think that a place like that sounds like the place for you, I invite you to check out our website at philathenaeum.org, or to reach out to me or Tess to learn more about how to join our growing community, because we'd love to have you be an actual part of our community and not just on these webinars, so that we can greet you when we see you. Now, before we start, I wanted to remind everybody that of some of the functions here. If you want to see just the person who's speaking, Leo, when he is talking, and not Tess and I, you want to go to the top right-hand corner. If you're on a computer, if it's a tablet or a phone, it's going to be a little different. So I'm sorry about that. But if you're on a computer, the speaker view, you want to click that, and it will just show the person who is speaking on the screen. Down at the bottom, you will see both a Q&A and a chat. Again, if it's on your phone or your iPad, it'll be a little bit different. And you can put questions anytime during the talk tonight in the Q&A or the chat section. After Leo finishes his talk, I will help moderate and facilitate the Q&A time by pulling your questions up from both of those sections and sharing them with Leo. So don't hesitate. If one pops in your brain and you're worried about not remembering it later, you can type it in at the moment, or you can type it in later. And we look forward to those questions and a lively conversation. Well, many scholars aim to write one or two or maybe three worthy books for an academic press that will get them their tenure and help them move up the ranks and keep their reputation in the scholarly world on the course of their career. But few scholars manage to do what tonight's speaker has done, to produce at least 4 carefully researched and eloquently narrated academic books, and then a treasure trove of books for the general public that are biographies on important people, as Leo has done. Bringing to life the thoughts and worlds of great thinkers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Jonathan Swift, and Alexis de Tocqueville, Dr. Leo Damrosch has now brought us intimately into the illustrious monthly club that boasted in its membership the top philosophers and writers and artists of the mid-18th century, like Samuel Johnson, Edmund Burke, James Boswell, and Joshua Reynolds. Dr. Leo Damrosch was born in the Philippines, and where he and his parents spent the first few years in a prison camp during World War II. After that, he grew up in Maine, and he holds degrees from Yale, Cambridge, and Princeton. After teaching at the universities of Virginia and Maryland, in 1989, he moved to Harvard, where he is now the professor emeritus of literature and continues to delight us all with his writing. So tonight, it is a pleasure and an honor to host Dr. Damrosch for an event that he has graciously allowed us to reschedule multiple times since we had to cancel the first one in the spring. So I invite you all to clap so loud that we will hear across the waves and welcoming Leo Damrosch tonight. And we look forward to hearing from you. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Beth. Such a pleasure to speak virtually at the Athenaeum. It would have been last April, and to have people with us from the New York Society Library, where I had the pleasure myself of speaking 6 years ago about my biography of Jonathan Swift. Now, as to the club, the book that's my subject tonight, it's a little disconcerting that I understand many people who are now present will have read the book, and I'm afraid there'll be a good deal of going over familiar ground for you. But one thing at least I can offer you is pictures that are easier to see, because although Yale University Press is wonderfully generous about including a lot of pictures, including very expensive color ones, many of them had to be reproduced very small. And if it's a large, complicated scene, I think they'll be easier for you to see on your monitor now. Well, the book is a kind of a group biography. It's about, as Beth mentioned, an incredible constellation of talent in late 18th century London. But they called themselves very unpretentiously the Club. It was founded in 1764 by the great painter Joshua Reynolds to help his friend Samuel Johnson out of a paralyzing depression, something Johnson was very subject to. They didn't have their own premises. They would meet every Friday at the Turks Head Tavern. Can I have the first slide? Maybe it's already up, Tess. Is that what we're seeing? Yeah. They took a private room on the second floor. They had a lot of wine. Johnson once said, "A tavern chair is the throne of human felicity." Turks Head changed a lot over the years, though it's still there. It was a pharmacy at the time this 19th century picture was made. Today it's occupied by the New Loon Moon supermarket. It originally had 9 members. They wanted as many different professions there as possible. They had law, politics, medicine, theater, painting, and literature. But at that time, of the 9 founders, only Johnson and Reynolds had much of a public reputation at all. Fame was never required to join, much less high social standing. What they wanted was conviviality, lively, intelligent conversation. And they said if only a few of us could show up in a given week, we would still entertain each other. Over the years, the club did grow gradually. They didn't want it too big for easy conversation. And they had a rule, election had to be unanimous. One blackball would keep a candidate out, and it often did. After the membership did grow, these 5 were the most extraordinary members. Samuel Johnson, I think arguably the greatest British critic of all time. Edmund Burke, I think everyone would agree, the greatest British orator and political thinker. James Boswell, the greatest British biographer. Edward Gibbon, the greatest historian. And Adam Smith, the greatest economist. At some points, I'll let you hear their own words as we go along because they're all so eloquent and interesting. Some of the others were, of course, Joshua Reynolds, the leading painter in his own day, the novelist and playwright Oliver Goldsmith, the actor David Garrick, the playwright and politician Richard Brinsley Sheridan. Alice says in Alice in Wonderland, "What's the use of a book without pictures or conversations?" Well, we do have these pictures, and we have a lot from their conversations, more than from any group I can think of in history, not just at the club itself, but elsewhere. And what survives is due above all to James Boswell, who was elected 9 years after the club began. Tess has reminded me that today is Boswell's birthday, 280 years ago. He lived in his native Edinburgh, where he was practicing law. That meant he could only be in London for 3 months of the year during the court recess. And all of his conversations with Johnson and the great life of Johnson come from those 3-month periods. All his life, Boswell kept an incredibly detailed journal, compulsively, really. And most days he tried to write down everything he could record from that day. And eventually the life of Johnson did make ample use of that material. Boswell was not an original thinker, but he was intelligent and perceptive, and he was ideally placed to appreciate other people's gifts. I always think of something Sherlock Holmes says to Watson. It may be you are not yourself luminous, but you are a conductor of light. Boswell had an unequaled ability to bring conversations to life. Not verbatim, of course, but he did reproduce the kinds of language that people used. And he described their tone of voice and their body language. And we also have further conversations in splendid journals kept by 2 women who knew members of this group very well. One was Hester Thrale, who for 20 years was virtually Johnson's therapist. She was the person to whom he confessed his deepest anxieties. And another was the young novelist Fanny Burney, witty and perceptive. And they and other women play such an important role in the story, I call them a shadow club. As for the pictures, I think authors often outsource illustrations. They finish the book and then somebody else is told to go find some pictures. When I begin a project, I start looking for them right from the beginning. They add so much to the story, and it's a great pleasure searching for them. Slide, please. These are facsimile signatures of the founding nine, and I like to show it because it brings out their individuality. There's Samuel Johnson, president. It simply meant he was elected that evening to preside over that one occasion. Flourishing signature next to his of Joshua Reynolds, president. Edmund Burke, not yet famous. Topham Beauclerk, just a young friend of Johnson's. Christopher Nugent, MD, that was Burke's father-in-law, which is why he was there. Oliver Goldsmith, well known today, but utterly unknown at that time. Bennet Langton, that was another of Johnson's young friends. Anthony Shamir, a businessman and civil servant. And at the bottom, John Hawkins, a magistrate and early biographer of Johnson. Well, most of those people would be forgotten today if they didn't pervade Boswell's life of Johnson. But though they never became famous, that doesn't mean they weren't intelligent and very interesting participants in those evenings at the club. Well, let's begin, of course, with Johnson. Most portraits show him in middle age or later, bewigged, scowling. He hated to sit for his portrait. Slide, please. I like this 19th century etching in a more romantic style. It's after an original by Ozias Humphrey. That's probably how Johnson really struck people, with a deep nobility of character. Now, until his mid-40s, Johnson was scraping by in London as an anonymous writer for hire. He turned out endless miscellaneous pamphlets and translations. In later years, he confessed he'd forgotten what most of them were. Slide, please. He became the editor of the Gentleman's Magazine. That was a monthly, a sort of 18th century Reader's Digest. It's interesting, its publisher invented that meaning for the word magazine. Up until then, it meant a military arsenal, like a powder magazine. There were a lot of writers in that humble condition, the so-called hack writers. They were known collectively as Grub Street. That was a real street, though most of them didn't actually live there. Johnson first made a name for himself with a periodical essay series called The Rambler. And in one of those essays, he says, Grub Street writers take no thought for posterity. They don't expect what they write to live beyond next week. Slide, please. This is the frontispiece to the original Life of Johnson. Boswell had it engraved after a painting by Reynolds. This is Johnson as a sage. He has one volume of his great Dictionary of the English Language, which came out in 1755, under his hand. A consortium of publishers had given him a big advance with which he hired 6 secretaries, and he invented the method that's still used by the Oxford English Dictionary. He would underline words in books, and the secretaries would copy out the whole sentence the word was in, and he would put them into the dictionary as illustrative examples. It made it really an immense anthology of quotations. Earlier dictionaries were just word lists with minimal definitions. Johnson's shows his responsiveness to the living language, nuances of meaning, the way it changes over time. The publication of the dictionary provoked an episode of great significance. Grub Street did not pay well. Johnson spent more than the advance could cover, but for the first time, it was possible, just barely, to live entirely by writing. Before then, writers and artists depended on patronage, usually from noblemen. Well, when Johnson got started on the dictionary, he did hope to get help from a nobleman, the famous Earl of Chesterfield, who had dropped hints that he might take an interest in the project. Slide, please. That's him, Philip Dormer Stanhope, 4th Earl of Chesterfield. He was a literary dilettante, famous for publishing letters of very worldly advice to his son, but he thought himself was a cultural giant. Slide, please. It turned out Chesterfield never did a thing for Johnson, and in this 19th century recreation, He let Johnson wait indignantly with a crowd of other people, hoping in vain to talk with the great man. Yet, when the dictionary was finally about to appear after years of work, Chesterfield let it be known he might like to have it dedicated to him. Johnson responded with a letter that became famous, and I'm going to quote from it for its eloquence and also for showing the old era of aristocratic patronage was over. Johnson says, "7 years, my lord, have passed since I waited in your outward rooms, or was repulsed from your door, during which time I have been pushing on my work through difficulties of which it is useless to complain, and have brought it at last to the verge of publication without one act of assistance, one word of encouragement, or one smile of favor. Such treatment I did not expect. I never had a patron before. Is not a patron, my lord, one who looks with unconcern on a man struggling for life in the water, and when he has reached ground, encumbers him with help." Not many years earlier, a group like the club would have been dominated by peers. But by now, the unchallenged prestige of the aristocracy was giving way to a dynamic middle-class culture. It was 13 years before even one peer was elected to the club. C.S. Lewis once made a memorable observation. It's in a book called Studies in Words. Lewis says, "When I was a boy, a bourgeois boy, that term was applied to my social class by the class above it. Bourgeois meant not aristocratic, therefore vulgar. When I was in my 20s, this changed. My class was now vilified by the class below it. Bourgeois began to mean not proletarian, therefore parasitic, reactionary. Thus, Lewis says, it has always been a reproach to assign someone to that class, which has provided the world with nearly all its divines, poets, philosophers, scientists, musicians, painters, doctors, architects, and administrators." By the time the dictionary came out, Johnson was acknowledged as the leading man of letters of his generation. He had dropped out of the University of Oxford as an undergraduate for lack of money, but it now gave him an honorary doctorate. Hence the title Dr. Johnson you constantly see. He himself refused to use it. By the way, it's lucky for us he didn't get his degree. If he had, he would certainly have gone into the law, and I'm sure he would have been a very distinguished judge, but nobody today would know his name. But writing still didn't pay well, and he was still living hand to mouth until a generous annual pension was conferred by the king. At the club, Johnson was definitely the dominant member. By the way, he came from Lichfield in Staffordshire in the Midlands. He never lost his regional accent. David Garrick, who as a boy had been his student in a school there, would imitate Johnson at the punch bowl. He would say, "Who's for punch?" Simon Vance, who is a very gifted reader, has done a really excellent audiobook of this book, The Club. He wrote to ask me about accents, and it adds a great deal to his performance of Johnson, and especially his wonderful Scottish accent for Boswell. Johnson loved argument as a kind of game. He could be bullying and overbearing. His friends said he was always talking for victory. He treated conversation as competition. When he was especially aggressive, there was no way to win an argument with him. Goldsmith told Boswell, if his pistol misses fire, he knocks you down with the butt end of it. Boswell especially relished Johnson's bon mots, but they weren't always as witty as Boswell thought they were. One time, Johnson was putting down Scottish writers. He always liked to tease Boswell by pretending to look down on the Scots. Boswell said, "But sir, we have Lord Kames." That was a distinguished judge, but very minor writer. Johnson said, "You have Lord Kames, keep him, ha, ha, ha." That was it, you had to be there. Well, I'm telling you that story because it tickled me in an old New Yorker to see this cartoon by the great Charles Addams. Slide, please. The caption is, Dr. Johnson gets off a good one, and he's bellowing, "You have Lord Kames, keep him, ha, ha, ha." But that's not really fair. Often Johnson's witticisms were brilliant. Boswell was once trying to get him interested in taking a trip to Ireland. They'd been to Scotland together. And Boswell said, "Is not the Giant's Causeway worth seeing?" That's a famous rock formation in County Antrim. Johnson said, and I always think of this when I travel, "Worth seeing, yes, not worth going to see." Johnson didn't care much for music. He was quite deaf, but someone dragged him to a concert by a virtuoso violinist. He didn't like it. His friend said he should have liked it because it was extremely difficult. Johnson said, "Difficult, do you call it, sir? I wish it was impossible." Not only wit, Johnson had humor too, which is harder to record in writing. Garrick said he would shake the laughter out of you. By the way, Boswell wasn't elected to the club until 1773, almost a decade after it began. Members liked him, but they thought of him as an agreeable lightweight. Johnson pressured them until they gave in and did elect him, and fortunate for posterity. Slide, please. This is Boswell in his early 20s on a grand tour. He's in Rome at the time. That was the very year after he met Johnson. With a curiously sulky, petulant expression, he asked the painter to put in that owl up above him. That was an attribute of the goddess Athena, symbolizing wisdom, which he hoped he was going to attain. He never did. He studied dutifully to qualify as a lawyer, but only in order to please his father, who was a very senior judge in Edinburgh. Slide, please. That's his father, Lord Auchinleck. You can see from his portrait, not just a judge, sternly judgmental. Boswell endured wounding sarcasm from his father and was never able to please him. The judge would be amazed to know that his son would gain permanent fame as a writer. He might not care. Johnson became the father Boswell should have had. Boswell became the son Johnson never had. As I mentioned, Boswell wasn't an original thinker. Most people aren't. What he did have was an exceptional gift for recreating lived experience in words. And a modern critic, W.K. Wimsatt of Yale, coined a fine phrase for that. He called it, Boswell was recording the fact imagined. Boswell's especially eloquent about what Rousseau, whom he met, called le sentiment de l'existence, the simple sensation of being. And here's an example from his journal that he wrote down when he was still just 23. I sat in all this evening, calm and indulgent. I had a fire in both my rooms above stairs. I drank tea by myself for a long time. I had my feet washed in milk-warm water. I had my bed warmed and went to sleep soft and contented. Not just one fire, coal was expensive, but two. Not just warm water, milk-warm water, as if fresh from the cow, and the sensual delight of feeling soft and contented. But there's something that goes unsaid. Who washed his feet for him? In writings from that period, servants were part of everyone's life, but mostly invisible. Boswell was capable also of brilliant analogies. As Johnson's friends knew, his superbly crafted writing was a defense against inner demons that never stopped tormenting him. That paralyzing depression I mentioned that provoked Reynolds to suggest forming the club, that was an extreme episode of what he suffered all the time. Here's Boswell's analogy in the life of Johnson. His mind resembled the vast amphitheater, the Colosseum at Rome. In the center stood his judgment, which, like a mighty gladiator, combated those apprehensions that, like wild beasts in the arena, were all around in cells ready to be let out upon him. After a conflict, he drove them back into their dens, but not killing them, they were still assailing him. Slide, please. It's another portrait of Johnson by Reynolds, reproduced here as a print. As the position of the hands indicates, he was subject to convulsive gestures, strange, repetitive movements. They terrified him. He thought they might be symptoms of insanity. Today, they would be understood as obsessive-compulsive disorder. It's an affliction, certainly, but a neurological malfunction. It's not insanity. Slide, please. This is a portrait of Johnson by Francis Reynolds. It's at Haverford College, nearby the Athenaeum. That was Sir Joshua's unmarried sister. She kept house for him. Johnson was very fond of her. He nicknamed her Rennie. And despite her great talent, her brother discouraged her from a public career. He didn't want the competition. Frances painted this wonderful portrait of Johnson, her close friend. It captures his massive bulk, his stooped posture and fatigue as he gazes earnestly out from the shadows. With its haunting honesty, it's a portrait Joshua wouldn't have painted, probably couldn't have painted. But it's important to stress, despite the psychological burden Johnson struggled against, his writings really did create wisdom and perspective. He was a master of language, not just a lexicographer. You've already heard his letter to Lord Chesterfield. I'll give you one more example. Johnson had no use whatever for literary theory, which was just as much a blight in those days as it is in ours. His final masterpiece was a collection of biographies called Lives of the Poets. And he says they are addressed not to critics, but to what he called the common reader, people who read simply for their own enjoyment. In my life as an academic, I've always taken this passage as a personal touchstone. Johnson says, works of imagination excel by their allurement and delight, by their power of attracting and detaining the attention. That book is good in vain, which the reader throws away. He only is the master who keeps the mind in pleasing captivity, whose pages are perused with eagerness, and in hope of new pleasure are perused again, and whose conclusion is perceived with an eye of sorrow, such as the traveler casts upon departing day. Now let's spend a little time with Francis Reynolds' brother, Joshua, the co-founder of the club. He was very proud of the official recognition that let him call himself Sir Joshua. Slide, please. Here's one of his self-portraits, not embarrassed by his physical disability, quite deaf. He usually carried an ear trumpet. Johnson called Reynolds a very thinking man. Reynolds said in turn, Johnson cleared my mind of a great deal of rubbish. Walter Jackson Bate, in his great biography of Johnson, has a memorable expression. He says Johnson would turn a thing upside down and shake the nonsense out of it. Reynolds got fabulously wealthy thanks to his ability to create a recognizable likeness that was also subtly flattering. He made stupid people look intelligent. He made plain people look handsome. Reynolds was at work every single day. He ran a virtual portrait factory. He would do the sitter's face. Assistants would do the clothing and the background and even the hands. William Blake was briefly a student at the Royal Academy of Art, which Reynolds was the first president. I published a book on Blake a few years ago. Blake struggled to make a living with his incredibly brilliant but extremely unpopular art. And Blake wrote bitterly, Reynolds' eye is on the many, or rather on the money. Slide, please. The Royal Academy held an annual exhibition, and it's not what you expect today in an art gallery. The pictures cover the walls right up to the ceiling, and not one person down there is looking at them. Slide, please. In this close-up in the center foreground, we see the Prince of Wales holding the exhibition catalog, and Reynolds gesturing up at one of the paintings. You can see in Reynolds' left hand his ear trumpet. You got to that exhibition room by climbing a steep spiral staircase. Slide, please. Thomas Rowlandson had fun caricaturing that. The title is The Exhibition Staircase, spelled S-T-A-R-E. A statue of Venus is looking on appreciatively while the spectators are treated to a view of English ladies in the flesh. Slide, please. Example of Reynolds, the portrait painter at his best. This ravishing portrait, it's at the Yale Center for British Art, is of an actress named Frances Abington. She played Lady Teazle in Sheridan's masterpiece, The School for Scandal. It was widely rumored that Reynolds was in love with her. In allegorical and biblical paintings, however, which were highly regarded at the time, Reynolds was less impressive. Slide, please. This is the child John the Baptist in the wilderness. Reynolds specialized in charming children, saccharine even. The Victorian painter William Frith in the 1830s asked an old man if he'd ever modeled before. Yes, once when I was a boy, a deaf gent done it. Leastways, he had an ear trumpet and I shouted at him. The old gent made me take off all but my trousers. There was a lamb in the picture as the old gent done. Slide, please. The other founding member of the club who went on to great fame, permanent fame, was Edmund Burke. When the club began, he was 35, not yet in Parliament. He was private secretary to someone who was, and he was known to the public only for a treatise on aesthetics. Gentlemen weren't usually shown wearing spectacles. Burke probably wanted it to suggest his thoughtfulness. He was the one member of the club whose conversation not even Boswell could get down on paper. It was so varied and inventive. Johnson said, Burke's stream of mind is perpetual. Johnson paid Burke another really wonderful tribute. When you think about it, compliments about somebody's friend tend to be generic and vague. They might say, Burke was a brilliant speaker, or I never admired anyone more than I did Burke, which doesn't tell you much. Johnson and Boswell were just chatting, taking a walk about their friends, and Burke's name came up. Johnson said, "You could not stand 5 minutes with that man beneath a shed while it rained, but you must be convinced you had been standing with the greatest man you had ever yet seen." That quote is a good example of how much we owe to Boswell. Passing moment in a conversation, immortalized by his gift for recreating reality. And he wrote that one down long before he ever thought of putting it in a biography. When Johnson was on his deathbed 20 years later from congestive heart failure in 1784, Boswell was in Scotland at the time, but he knew he was going to write the biography, and he got material from everyone who was there. One friend who was present said when Burke came by, he said he was afraid Johnson might find it oppressive to have visitors. Johnson said, "No, sir, it is not so. I must be in a wretched state indeed, when your company would not be a delight to me." Burke said in a tremulous voice, "My dear sir, you have always been too good to me." What a tribute to a deep friendship between two extraordinary people. Slide, please. This is Burke orating in Parliament. He was absolutely spellbinding. Afterwards, he would publish his speeches, and they became classics. Let me just give you one example. We Americans remember his great speeches on conciliation with the colonies, essentially, don't start taxing when you didn't do it before. Even more impressive was his moral crusade on behalf of India. As you probably know, a commercial organization, the East India Company, had become the de facto ruler of much of that huge subcontinent. Eventually, Britain had to send out some official administrators. Even then, a great ancient civilization with a huge population was being governed as a cash cow, much against its will. Burke and his allies in Parliament brought an impeachment trial in the House of Commons against the Governor General, Warren Hastings, for corruption. Hastings was eventually acquitted by the House of Lords, which they probably expected. It's like acquittal by the Senate. Their goal was to raise national consciousness about what was being done in their name far away. This is one of Burke's great speeches on India. Young men, boys almost, govern there, without society and without sympathy with the natives, animated with all the avarice of age and all the impetuosity of youth. They roll in one after another, wave after wave, and there's nothing before the eyes of the natives but an endless, hopeless prospect of new flights of birds of prey, with appetites continually renewing for a food that is continually wasting. Were we to be driven out of India this day, nothing would remain to tell it had been possessed during the inglorious period of our dominion by anything better than the orangutan or the tiger. In E.M. Forster's Passage to India, a century and a half later, India was still being governed from England by young men, boys almost. I'll show you one more of the founding members of the club, Oliver Goldsmith. He was originally a Grub Street hack, just like Johnson, but became a poet of considerable distinction and a playwright. His big hit was a comedy, She Stoops to Conquer. And he wrote a very popular short novel, The Vicar of Wakefield. Slide, please. He probably looked very much like this unkind sketch by Henry Bunbury. Slide, please. This is Goldsmith's portrait by Reynolds. He was one of Reynolds' closest friends. Reynolds does show he was very plain, but he also brings out his intelligence and depth. Before we go on to a few later members of the club, let's take a brief tour of 18th century London, the milieu they lived and thrived in. A historian calls Johnson the greatest Londoner of the 18th century, the way Dickens would be in the 19th. Slide, please. English travelers in Venice loved Canaletto, and they persuaded him to come to England to paint their country houses and London scenes like this one. This could almost be Venice. We're at the terrace of Richmond House. There's a very un-English shimmer of light on the water. In the distance, St. Paul's Cathedral, taking the place of Santa Maria della Salute on the Grand Canal in Venice. Slide, please. This close-up shows a scene of tranquil privilege. Behind the garden wall on the lower left, a gentleman in red is rapping on the door with his walking stick. And at the top left, the window up there, a servant girl is leaning out of the balcony. Slide, please. Across the river, some rather odd-looking vessels are being rowed like Venetian galleys. Those are ornate barges representing the livery companies that controlled the various trades. Commerce is being represented here only symbolically. That is not Johnson's London. For that, we need to go to Charing Cross. Slide, please. This is an engraving by Rowlandson, hand-colored, of course. Johnson said once, "I think the full tide of human existence is at Charing Cross." It was a surging and even threatening tide. The novelist Tobias Smollett wrote, "The different departments of life are jumbled together here, rambling, riding, rolling, rushing, jostling, mixing, bouncing, cracking, and crashing in one vile ferment of stupidity and corruption." In this image, a crowd is gathered to watch two men in the pillory. If they thought the punishment was unjust, they could be friendly, but if they thought the crimes were wicked, they would throw stones and bricks. The historian says, of all the punishments to strike fear into the criminal's heart, death in the pillory was the most terrible. Slide, please. Images like that one are often full of narrative detail. The lower left, the woman in green is stooping down to pick up some stones, while a dog takes advantage to ransack her basket. At the far right there, the woman in pink is flirting with a soldier. And at the center, the woman in blue has her back to the action, complacently accepting a man's hand on her breast. Slide, please. This is Covent Garden by a painter named Balthazar Naboth, not altogether changed today, with its fashionable, tranquil, classical church. At the left are stands filled with vegetables. It was an actual market garden. Farmers brought in produce every morning. Slide, please. This engraving by Rowlandson is the same scene, but in a very different spirit. It's an election campaign. A hustings has been set up in front of the church. That's what a hustings was. Slide, please. The candidate for parliament is a naval officer, so his supporters are carrying him in a boat. Slide, please. This shopping arcade in Covent Garden was known by the rather pretentious name of the Piazzas. Slide, please. It's the same arcade in 2010, seen from the opposite direction. This picture was captioned, "New Apple Store opens at Covent Garden Piazza." The Shakespeare Tavern was located there. One of the waiters published Harris's List of Covent Garden Ladies. That was a directory of prostitutes describing their appearance and their specialties, updated annually. Boswell sometimes took women there, but usually he just picked up streetwalkers for a hasty, sordid encounter in some dark alley. They were mostly orphaned teenagers struggling to survive. He paid them pathetically small sums and felt guilty afterwards, but he didn't think much about their plight. Those encounters are all recorded in his very full journal for 1762 and 63. That's also when he met Johnson. Boswell was in his early 20s. Boswell's journals, you may know, were long thought to be lost and rediscovered in the 20th century. When this one was published in 1950 as Boswell's London Journal, its scandalousness made it a Book of the Month Club bestseller. Johnson had known prostitutes personally in his down and out days. He understood they were not bad girls who went wrong. They were victims of a tacitly condoned institution. In an age of arranged marriages, no possibility of divorce, it was thought of as a safety valve. What was less recognized was there were very few respectable ways a woman could earn a living. The usual options were a low-ranking domestic servant, such as a parlor maid or scullery maid, a seamstress, every girl was taught to ply her needle. If she was educated, a governess. A character in Jane Austen's Emma compares being a governess to slavery. In one of his Rambler essays, Johnson imagines a prostitute telling her story. When she was young, a relative seduced her, got her pregnant, kept her as a mistress for a while, then dropped her completely. By then, there was only one means of survival, even though she hated it. And Johnson imagines her saying, "In this abject state, I have now passed 4 years, the drudge of extortion and the sport of drunkenness. Sometimes the property of one man, sometimes the common prey of accidental lewdness. If those who pass their days in plenty and security could visit for an hour the dismal receptacles to which the prostitute retires from her nocturnal excursions, and see the wretches that lie crowded together, mad with intemperance, ghastly with famine, nauseous with filth, noisome with disease, it would not be easy for any degree of abhorrence to repress the desire which they must feel to rescue human beings from a state so dreadful. Johnson said he had known the woman whose story that was. Late one night, Johnson responded to the cries for help of a sick prostitute who was lying half dead in the street. He literally carried her to his house on his back. He was a huge, strong man. He got in a doctor who cured her. He took up a collection among his friends to set her up as a milliner with a shop of her own in a country town where she lived a happy, successful life for many years. William Hazlitt said in the 19th century, this story realizes the parable of the Good Samaritan. Just a couple more London scenes and we'll move on to other characters in the story. In our very first picture, we saw those ornamental barges that symbolized commerce. Now some actual commerce. Slide, please. The arches under the old London Bridge were too narrow to let ships of any size get through. You can see the ebb tide is rushing downstream through the arches. Slide, please. Below the bridge was where big ocean-going vessels docked. That was known as the Pool of London. There's a forest of masts lining the wharves, the Tower of London in the distance. That time, the pool was handling 1,500 ships a year, carrying close to 250,000 tons of goods. In the right foreground are barrels of French wine. It was normally bottled at the place of destination. There's a crate of bottles in front of the barrels. Slide, please. Among the crowd, a young black servant is pointing derisively at a couple of ladies who are ostentatiously kissing. Several thousand freed slaves were employed as servants in London. A friend of Johnson's, who had moved to Jamaica, gave a young boy his freedom and sent him to relatives in England. They in turn gave him to Johnson as a household servant. His name was Francis Barber. He became really a surrogate son to Johnson. Johnson sent him to an excellent school, and when he died, left Francis a generous bequest. By then he had married an Englishwoman and settled down in comfort. More than most people at the time, Johnson absolutely hated slavery. One time he was visiting Oxford, where the politics were very conservative, and he was asked to propose a toast. So he rose and said, "Here's to the next insurrection of the Negroes in the West Indies." Let's spend a little time with the most significant members who were added to the club in later years. In 1773, David Garrick, same year as Boswell. He had come to London with Johnson 30 years before when they both hoped to seek their fortune. Johnson got fame, but not fortune. Garrick got both. Years later, somebody remarked, who would have thought these two obscure young men from the same town would end up buried next to each other in Westminster Abbey? Slide, please. This is Garrick's country villa on the Thames at Hampton. He's taking tea with his wife, Eva, together with guests, while one of his brothers is fishing. There are just two officially licensed theater in the whole of London, Covent Garden and Drury Lane. They had packed houses, rowdy audiences. Slide, please. This is Covent Garden. That's the pit in the foreground with backless benches right below the stage, and up above, more expensive galleries. Slide, please. Below the stage, there's the orchestra playing, and just above that, the royal box. George III and Queen Charlotte are in attendance. She gave her name to Charlottesville, Virginia, and Charlotte, North Carolina. Slide, please. Drury Lane this time. This is the pit right below the stage. Everybody's having a great time. Slide, please. Except the man on the far right who has evidently been banged in the head. Garrick became the manager of Drury Lane, and like a modern director, he rehearsed his actors as an ensemble, emphasizing eye contact and body language. Until then, actors just stood around passively until it was time to recite their own lines. Slide, please. This is the Drury Lane gallery, up above and behind the pit. Fashionable young men are gazing at the women, not at the stage, and flirting if they detect encouragement. Slide, please. Boswell was an incorrigible exhibitionist, and he couldn't resist telling a story about himself in print, which inspired this caricature. In a wild freak of youthful extravagance, I entertained the audience prodigiously by imitating the lowing of a cow. The audience started calling out, "Encore the cow!" And Boswell was inspired to attempt some other barnyard animals, but with less success. He had a clergyman friend from Edinburgh with him who said earnestly, "My dear sir, I would confine myself to the cow." Those spikes in the foreground were to keep enthusiastic members of the audience from clambering up on the stage. Boswell said he always liked to sit at the spikes. Slide, please. Garrick amazed everyone with naturalistic acting that had never been seen before, and his sensational breakthrough was as Richard III. Hogarth, his friend, painted this picture of Garrick's famous start when Richard jumps up from a nightmare. It's the night before the Battle of Bosworth Field, at which he will be killed. He had been dreaming that the ghosts of his victims were telling him so. To modernize, this looks posed and stagey, but to audiences back then, it conveyed a convincing sense of spontaneity, as if he was truly terrified. The setting is, of course, Hogarth's addition. There was no real stage scenery and no way to create lighting effects. When Garrick spoke Hamlet's "to be or not to be," he made you feel he was thinking the words for the very first time. Slide, please. Garrick was only 5'3". He made that as an advantage as King Lear. He was apparently the first ever to play Lear as old and feeble. And a fellow actor wrote down this wonderful account of Garrick's performance. "I never see him coming down from one corner of the stage with his old gray hair standing, as it were, erect on his head, his face filled with horror and attention, his hands expanded and his whole frame actuated by a dreadful solemnity. But I am astounded. I share in his distress. I feel the dark, drifting rain and the sharp tempest." That admirer says, "I never see him. No matter how often you saw Garrick as King Lear, you were still overwhelmed. And on that crude, candlelit Drury Lane stage, he could make you feel the storm." Also, his delivery was wonderfully expressive. This account continues, "With what superlative tenderness does he speak these words? Pray do not mock me, for as I am a man, I take that lady to be my child Cordelia." Garrick wasn't especially handsome. That was a drawback in romantic roles. At Covent Garden, a rival actor named Spranger Barry was a competing Romeo. The woman who saw them both said, if she'd been Garrick's Juliet, she would have expected him to climb up to her balcony. If she'd been Barry's Juliet, she would have climbed down. Finally, pictures of two more remarkable club members who were not among the original 9. In this brief talk, I can only hint at their greatness. In the book, I try to give them something of what they deserve in a chapter each. Edward Gibbon and Adam Smith. Slide, please. Gibbon was elected in 1774, a year after Garrick and Boswell. This is by Reynolds again. Gibbon loved this portrait. Francis Reynolds said it was amazing how well it minimized his real ugliness. People said Gibbon's face reminded them of the rear end of a baby. Boswell hated Gibbon. He called him the infidel. That's because of a notorious chapter in The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, arguing there was no need to invoke providence to explain the rise of Christianity. There were plenty of adequate secular causes, and also highly skeptical of the early miracles that supposedly confirmed the divine origin of the church. The Decline and Fall was published 2 years after Gibbon was elected to the club. He would never have gotten in if they'd known what was coming. For the same reason, the greatest British philosopher was never elected, even though he was a friend of Boswell's, and that was David Hume. The Decline and Fall is a true masterpiece. I've devoted an entire lecture course to it in the videotaped Great Courses series. Gibbon based it on exhaustive scholarship with thousands of footnotes. It never occurred to Voltaire in his very popular histories to give you a single footnote. Now, by pondering the sources with the reader, Gibbon is teaching us to weigh evidence along with him. But he also has a driving narrative energy through thousands of pages. When Winston Churchill was a young army officer in India, he began to read seriously for the first time in his life. He started with The Decline and Fall, and in an early memoir, he says, "I was immediately dominated, both by the story and the style. All through the long, glistening middle hours of the Indian day, I devoured Gibbon. I rode triumphantly through it and enjoyed it all. Slide, please. This is Gibbon late in life, in retirement at Lausanne in Switzerland. By then he was frighteningly obese. He was only 5 feet tall. His best friend said he was like a turtle. If he lay down on his back, he wouldn't be able to get up again. Gibbon didn't mind joking about it. For some years, he was a member of parliament, representing a remote borough in Cornwall that a relative of his controlled. He never went there even once. His joke was, how is a fat man like a Cornish borough? And the answer is, because he never sees his member. Slide, please. Adam Smith, elected in 1775, just 1 year before his masterpiece, identified on this picture, the author of The Wealth of Nations. I'm no economist, but from my reading, I'm convinced our popular image of Smith is badly oversimplified. He did talk about the invisible hand, but he didn't think it was sacred. He thought government should intervene whenever appropriate. He never heard the expression laissez-faire, which was not yet invented. His great achievement was to create the concept of the economy. The massive impersonal forces that operate with their own logic are only partly responsive to administrative actions. Slide, please. I'll close with James Boswell once more. We're now in the 1790s. He's in his 50s. Johnson had died 10 years before. Goldsmith and Garrick were gone too. Once again, the portrait is by Reynolds, who was a close friend. It shows Boswell very truthfully as sadly weary. By this time, he had a bitter sense of failure. He never got far in his public career as a lawyer. He wanted very badly to get elected to Parliament. That never happened. He's a perfect illustration of the difference between a career and a vocation. A career is a climb up the ladder of success. Boswell never got more than a couple of rungs up that ladder. A vocation is chosen for its own sake, and his real vocation was capturing his experience in writing and eventually turning that skill to superb use in the life of Johnson. Slide, please. In 1918, when Johnson's house at Gough Square was being turned into a Johnson museum, we can still visit it, Max Beerbohm gave the museum this affectionate caricature. The minuscule handwriting is Beerbohm's witty parody of both men's writing style. The picture, showing Boswell worshiping his hero, brings out the fact Johnson was much bigger than Boswell, not just physically either. All his life, Boswell was subject to scary mood swings. He would feel profound depression for days or weeks and then unexpectedly surging elation. Today, he would certainly be diagnosed as having bipolar disorder. In those days, nobody had any idea of that. He was also increasingly alcoholic. By the time of the portrait, there were episodes of falling downstairs and getting badly injured. He would have no recollection of what he did the previous night. Also, over the years, his journals record no fewer than 17 separate venereal infections, which led to kidney failure. It would kill him at the age of 54. Slide, please. This sketch by Thomas Lawrence is much less flattering than Reynolds' portrait. Thomas Carlyle, who was a fellow Scot, had a withering description of this picture. That cocked nose, cocked partly in triumph over his weaker fellow creatures, partly to snuff up the smell of coming pleasure and scent it from afar. Those bagged cheeks hanging like half-filled wineskins, still able to contain more. That coarsely protruded shelf mouth, that fat, dewlapped chin. But amazingly, in these sad last years, Boswell was researching and writing the immortal life of Johnson. It was the only thing he ever challenged himself to do as well as he possibly could. And it's thanks to Boswell, above all, that we can still enter the world of the club. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was fabulous, fabulous, fabulous. And you did share stuff from the book, but not everything. So if you have not read the book, there are more stories in it that are just so wonderful to hear. I'd like to invite anybody who has questions now. You can put them in the Q&A or you can put them in the chat, and we will ask those of Leo. I wanted to start. I thought it's very interesting that Boswell made such a big deal about being pious and his religious faith, and yet he had no compunction with the hundreds of prostitutes in his life. How do you understand how do you understand that kind of that disjuncture between what his faith says and how he acted?
Well, Johnson often reproved him for that. Johnson was, in fact, deeply pious, in fact, had a rather terrifying foreboding that he would be damned and sent to hell because his life had not been good enough. Johnson brooded about the parable of the talents, where he had been given great talents and had wasted them, in his opinion. Boswell had religiosity rather than religion. He liked the emotion of religion. He actually flirted with converting to Catholicism at one time because he loved the incense and the music. And he was once in church listening to the sermon, and he wrote down in his diary that night, it was the strangest thing. I was listening in all sincerity to these pious thoughts and still making plans to have women that night. And so in his view, there was no real contradiction. He was just Boswell being Boswell. I'm not condoning it, but that's how he managed his life.
How did the club change over the years since it went on for decades? You said at some point peers were invited. Did the nature of the conversation shift and change, or did it maintain that high?
It got too big. Johnson stopped going most of the time because what he wanted was a small enough group to just hang out together and all speak freely, and it became more people holding forth. And even though he could hold forth, that was not what he thought it was for. Also, as I mentioned in the book, I mentioned what I call the Shadow Club. He was actually living with Hester Thrale and her husband at their estate on the other side of the Thames at Streatham. They basically took him in after another horrific breakdown and saved his life. And while he was there, he had a fascinating, lively social existence with people of both sexes, and he enjoyed that more than by then he did the club. It also, it had more and more people who were politically opposed to each other, so they had to agree never to talk about politics, which kind of spoiled the point of the thing. And by the time Johnson died in 1784, it had turned into a kind of institution that was nothing like the club had been at the beginning, and many of the first members were gone by then too. It went right on in the 20th century. It admitted quite a few famous conservative politicians, but Winston Churchill was regarded as too outrageous to be a member. He founded another group called the Other Club.
Oh, these questions are coming in. I'm like back and forth. Okay, this is interesting. Someone wanted to know if you could comment about Johnson's eyesight.
Yeah, he, as an infant, he developed what was then called scrofula, which is some kind of tubercular infection created by infected milk, probably from the wet nurse that was nursing him. He lost all sight in one eye and was very myopic and poorly sighted in the other. And so all his life, you've seen portraits of him, he'll hold a book up a couple of inches from his face. And also, a physician recently wrote about this. In every portrait, his head is tilted to the right. That was true of the ones you were just looking at. And apparently, it was a very difficult birth, and he had some kind of neurological damage as a result of childbirth. There's some cranial nerve that can be confidently identified today as causing that head tilt. So he had huge problems, and basically one reason he was a compulsive reader is he could actually see the book clearly, and scenery meant nothing to him when he was traveling in the Highlands of Scotland because he couldn't really perceive it.
Interesting. So we have, first of all, when did the club meet? Over a midday or evening meal, late at night? And were there any American visitors?
It was an evening meal on Fridays because Burke's father-in-law was Catholic. There was always an omelet for him, so he wouldn't have to eat meat. As they finished dining, they were already drinking wine. They drank a lot more wine. Johnson sometimes didn't drink at all because he said he could abstain, but he couldn't be moderate. It was just convivial, and they stayed until midnight or even later until they felt like going home.
Sounds like great Athenaeum parties. There's a question here. If you could talk a little bit about Boswell's grand tour, recalling that he met General Paoli among others on that tour.
Paoli, we say in Italian.
Oh, sorry.
The reason there's a Paoli, Pennsylvania, is that he was like the George Washington of Corsica, which he was going to liberate, although it didn't happen. And so he, was a spokesman for freedom. Two members of parliament who were also considered radicals were Wilkes and Barry, which is why you have a Wilkes-Barre. Well, Boswell was funded by his father to go on the grand tour because the idea was you would meet other well-placed young British people that would be important contacts in later life, and you would pick up languages and it would sort of round you as a gentleman. And he spent a long time doing it. He started with Germany. In fact, I'm now just completing a biography of all people of Giacomo Casanova. And in, I forget which German town, Boswell writes in his diary, I met this insufferable Italian named Neuhaus, who thinks he knows everything. And that was simply a Germanization of Casanova. Boswell's modern editor didn't guess that's who he had met. He went on to Italy. He liked that. He had some affairs with women, of course. He met Rousseau and also Voltaire because he was a very pushy young man and cultivated them as heroes. And then did eventually go to Corsica, which nobody was doing, because Rousseau said he should, because that little island might still achieve some kind of true independence. Rousseau had written Social Contract, of course, and absolutely became devoted to General Paoli, who was an extraordinary man. And when Paoli was expelled from Corsica, which then and ever after has been governed by France, Paoli came to London and became a good friend with Johnson. And Boswell's first publication was a book about Corsica, which, although largely cut and paste, included excerpts from his own diary there. And that was something quite original and interested people. And I think that's when he got the idea, I could do this for Johnson, and I have this diary.
Well, we're keeping a lot of questions. I think we've got a lot of great. Some people are just gonna have to read the book too. But I'm gonna pull some of these that I know that you may not get the full answer from the book, but might get some of your suppositions now. Do you think that by the end of Teddy's life that Johnson loved her, or was he ruled by his fear of hell, as you've described he felt?
He believed he loved her. Teddy was an older woman, 20 years older than himself, whom he'd married when he was a gangling and unprepossessing young man, except he was incredibly smart, and she knew that. And apparently it was a very satisfactory relationship when it began, sexually as well as intellectually. But as they got older, they had less in common. She became not only alcoholic, but an opium addict, which was very easy in those days. You got it at the drugstore. And they lived apart much of the time. And Johnson always felt guilty about Teddy. And after her death, he kind of turned her into a sanctified spirit. It was nothing phony about it. But people who had known her said it was kind of ridiculous. So it's a kind of poignant and painful story in his life.
And was it his physical limitations, do you think, that kept him from marrying again after she died, or was it that she was?
It might have been partly that. There was a pious and beautiful younger woman back in his native Staffordshire, whom he corresponded with regularly and was seriously talking to about marriage. And then she suddenly contracted, as people so often did, some fatal disease. And that was kind of heartbreaking too. But I think he also was fundamentally a bachelor, had always lived as a bachelor. And as indeed Reynolds did. Reynolds didn't mind having a sister as, as housekeeper, but a kind of independence that would have been compromised.
So I have two last questions I'm going to go here. I think are kind of fun ones. One, who were Johnson's favorite authors or works of literature?
He was very eclectic. That's the remarkable thing. He loved Shakespeare from boyhood and published a great important edition of Shakespeare's plays. But he didn't love theater because he could hardly hear or see what was going on, as Garrick often reminded him. I think he loved the Latin classics the best. He apparently could not only read but speak Latin as fluently as English. So he would immerse himself in Horace and Virgil as kind of fountains of wisdom. He didn't have much use for novels, and that's interesting to me because it was at his time that the great English novel was being born. And he did know Samuel Richardson, who wrote Clarissa, but he despised Fielding, the greatest of them all, and laughed at Sterne. He said, "Nothing odd will do long. Tristram Shandy did not last." And I've often thought, instead of trying as he did to write a blank verse play, which was a failure, or a rhyming couplets poem translating Juvenal into modern English, he should have been a novelist, but he never thought of doing such a thing.
Mm. And there's a question wondering why, or if it doesn't look like there were any musicians ever involved in the club, even though England had such a strong musical life in that time, and wondering why that was.
It's a good question. In the very last year of Johnson's life, Charles Burney finally got elected, who was an accomplished musician and musicologist. He wrote a great history of music. He used to rehearse Handel's orchestra for him and things like that. So that Shadow Club circles certainly enjoyed music and often had performers in. And Hester Thrale, after her husband died, actually married an Italian musician. But I think they thought of music as not one of the liberal arts, just as painting always had been thought. Reynolds fought heroically to give painting the prestige it deserved.
Well, I'll ask you here, I think this is a fun last question for you. Did you expect, as you were working on this book, that it would become as popular as it has?
No, I didn't. But as my wife and my agent both have said, and my editor too, it was obviously fun to write. I'd been reading and knowing about these people for literally half a century without expecting to write this kind of book. And when I decided to, there was still plenty I didn't know, but there's also a sense of knowing the landscape, and you know your way around, and you know where to look for things. And so it was a real pleasure to be working on it. And I think maybe that comes through.
Yeah, it is fabulous, and we're so grateful you came. And Tess is pulling through here some of the upcoming events that we have, both our afternoons at the Athenaeum noontime events, which are about half-hour talks, which give you insight into some really neat things in our collections, as well as our evening talks that are coming up. Invite you to subscribe to our newsletter. If you don't currently subscribe, you'll get a weekly reminder of the events that we have coming up. And become a member. If you have enjoyed tonight and enjoy what we provide for you, we invite you to become a part of this community of people who enjoy lively conversation and learning and growing in the arts and the humanities and all that we have to offer. Don't forget to buy the book. You can get it at bookshop.org at that right down there. And Tess, when you send out an email tomorrow, right, you'll include a link, so it won't be too late to buy the book. We are so grateful, Leo, that you gave your time to us tonight. Glad you didn't have to travel in the rain, but we look forward to being able to host you sometime, maybe your next book at the Athenaeum for another convivial evening. So thank you so much. Thank you, everybody who joined us.
Thank you for the invitation. It was my pleasure.
And hope everybody has a nice, wonderful evening and stays dry, and we'll see you all again soon.